Hi there. In this series of tutorials, I'm going to show you how you can draw stock charts, also known as line charts, using SwiftUI. But before we get to the programming, I would like to discuss the basics with you. So here we have an iPhone. There is some kind of frame that has a width and height where we are going to draw our line chart. Now, before we get to the drawing, there's some bad cases we have to consider where we have less than 2 points. There's no point in drawing because if you have just 0 points, there's nothing to draw. If you have 1 point, there's nothing you can compare it to and you can't really draw a line. So it only gets interesting once you have at least 2 points. So how do we determine the y coordinate? Let's look at this example. Let's say we have the Apple stock prices on 5 days. On Monday, for example, going for 124.88, and on Friday you have it on 120.88. So the question now is, how do we map these prices into our chart? The first thing we do is we determine the maximum and the minimum value of our data set. So in this case, the maximum value is 134.4 and 128.8 is our minimum. So now that we know the maximum and minimum value, we can say, well, assuming that the height of our frame is 300 pixel, the 134.4, which is our maximum, could be drawn at the point 300 pixel, and the 120.88, which is our minimum, could be drawn at a 0 pixel height. So another way to think about this is simply saying, hey, we can calculate it by saying 1 times height for the maximum value and 0 times height for the minimum value. So now you might wonder, fine, that works for the minimum and maximum value, but how does it work for the other values in between? So what about y0, 1, and 3? Obviously, they must be either on the same spot or in between 0 and 1. It can't be that one of these points are higher than the highest value we already found. So how do we determine them? Well, there's this formula that's called the normalization formula. And let's do an example. In this case, we're looking at the y0. We take the y value, so in this case, y0, 124.88, and we subtract it from the minimum. So the minimum is 120.88. We divide this by the maximum value minus the minimum value. So in this case, 134.4 minus 120.88. And we get a value between 0 and 1 that represents y0. So once we have this value, the 0.296 is our factor that we're going to use to multiply with the height. So with multiplying to the height, we know the exact y coordinate for that point. Similarly, you can do it for the other points, y1 and y3, and you can figure out what the y coordinate for each of these dataset elements are. So this is how we determine the y coordinate. It's not that tricky. So let's have a look at how we determine the x coordinate. Now for this, I try to pick an easier example. So let's say we have some kind of orange stock, and we also look at the prices on 5 days. So let's say $10, $20, and on the last day it's $50. And here we have the width, which is 400 pixel. Now our initial idea might be, all right, we have 5 data points, right? So can't we just simply divide the width by the number of points? So in this case, 5 points, and then say, all right, the first point we draw obviously at x equaling 0, and the second point at 80, the third point is 3 times 80. And we could try to do this with this formula, but at some point you will notice there's something wrong with this calculation. So what is the problem we have here? Well, when x equals 4, what we're doing is we assume that the max width should be 400 pixel, the width, right? But 4 times 80 is 320, it's not 400. So there's something wrong with our calculation. So the chart that we are actually drawing doesn't even look like this, but it looks more like this. So our calculation was not really right. We did some mistake somewhere. So let's figure out what the issue is. It turns out it doesn't make sense to divide it by 5 points, but we should rather divide it by 5 minus 1 points. So in general, the number of data points minus 1, and that would actually give us the right distance between these points, so we can determine the x-coordinate for each of these. So with that in mind, we already can use the similar formula. So the corrected formula looks like this. We take the index and then we multiply it by the width divided by the number of points minus 1. So in conclusion, the formula for the y-coordinate is as follows. To get the factor between 0 and 1, we just take that price, subtract it from the minimum price in the whole data set, and divide it by the maximum of the data set and the minimum of the data set. And to get the actual y-coordinate, we simply multiply this factor that is between 0 and 1 times the height. So the formula for the x-coordinate, remember we always index starting from 0. So we simply say index times the width divided by number of points minus 1. I hope this was helpful, and in the next part we will get to the programming of this line chart in SwiftUI. Thank you for watching and see you in the next part.